Monster Hunter World is nearly upon us, and this past weekend Capcom ran one final beta test before the final game ships. Lots of viewers have been asking us to look at the game then, so we thought it would be interesting to check out this beta and then promptly stack it up against the final game after we get our hands on that. It'll certainly be interesting to see what kind of changes Capcom has in store for us with the final game, and testing this beta should help give us an idea of how the game has evolved since this build. Of course, when the final game rolls around, we'll also have the Xbox versions to test out, which should prove rather interesting. But for now though, we're talking about the beta as it appears on the PS4 Pro, and of course, the base PS4. At its core, Monster Hunter World has been crafted using Capcom's in-house MT framework engine. It's a powerful engine and set of tools that is well suited to this type of game. In fact, the last generation of Monster Hunter was built on this mobile iteration of the engine, so it kind of feels like a perfect way to transition to a more powerful machine. And this transition has an enormous impact on the experience of playing Monster Hunter. Previous games were divided up into a series of individual maps, all split by various loading screens. But with Monster Hunter World, the game has been opened up into a much larger explorable world without any loading points at all. Well, aside from loading into the mission, of course. That's not to say Capcom has gone full open world here, mind you. There are still limitations on where you can and cannot go, but I feel in the case of Monster Hunter, this is actually kind of preferable and it works really well here. This is also the first time in quite a while that the series has received a significant boost in visual quality. Now, on its own, it may not necessarily appear cutting edge, but it's clearly a generational leap beyond Monster Hunter on 3DS. When taking it all together then, we have a rather handsome game here. There's some nice animation work here, huge environments, and a great sense of scale, and the monsters of course look excellent. But what about the basics like resolution then? Well, it's a little more complicated than usual here. If you're using a PS4 Pro for instance, the game offers 3 unique modes, all of which we'll be talking about throughout this video. Now, each mode is pretty clear in what it does. The prioritize resolution option, for instance, well, increases the resolution of the game at the expense of performance and visual features. In comparison, the performance mode focuses on boosting the frame rate, while the prioritize visuals option reduces things like LOD pop-in and increases the overall level of detail across the world. Good stuff, right? So what are we actually seeing then in terms of resolution? Well, our preliminary pixel count suggests that we're looking at 3200 by 1800p here, a rather common number on the PS4 Pro and one that works rather well on a 4K screen. Look a little closer though and you'll start to notice what appear to be checkerboard rendering artifacts along various edges. Plenty of visible stippling is present throughout the image, which is a telltale sign of this rendering technique. Then we have the performance and visual modes, which both turn in pixel counts of 1080p. What makes this odd, however, is that they also appear to exhibit the same edge stippling effects that we've seen when using the 1800p mode. And this same artifact I'm talking about is also present on the base PS4 as well. Clearly, there's some sort of rendering trickiness in use here. Naturally, we've contacted Capcom for clarification on the matter, and we'll have a lot more to say when the final game releases. But right now, we do know that the high-res mode is 1800p on the PS4 Pro, and every other mode, including the base system, are 1080p. It's really just a question of how they get there. Beyond resolution then, there are certainly differences between each mode, as you would expect. The high resolution mode should be obvious enough. I mean, it's sharper and cleaner due to the higher resolution, right? But what about the other modes, like the prioritize visuals option? Well, here we did notice things like improved LOD management as noted earlier, which does help make for a more stable presentation overall, but it's really not a night and day kind of jump here. Performance mode in comparison is in line with what we see on the base PS4. It just focuses on getting the frame rate up as high as it can go on the Pro. Where the real differences lie then is in the performance, and this is the major point of contention I have with the game right now. The gist here is that the frame rate is completely uncapped, and none of the modes exhibit anything approaching stability. Let's start with the high resolution mode on the PS4 Pro. This is of course the sharpest looking mode of the game, but it comes at a price. The frame rate generally hangs below 60 frames per second. In fact, it's barely above 30 FPS most of the time. But John, there's lots of games that run at 30 FPS and you're okay with those, right? What's the issue here? Okay, this is something I've discussed many times before, but it ultimately comes down to a frame rate that does not divide evenly into the refresh rate. This means that each frame will persist on screen for a variable length of time, which in turn means serious judder. It just doesn't look smooth in motion. A proper, evenly frame-paced 30 frames per second will always look much smoother than, say, 33 frames per second for this reason. Now, what's frustrating about this is that a simple 30 FPS cap would solve the problem entirely, as the frame rate remains above 30 FPS pretty much all the time. But of course we have to keep in mind that this is just a beta build, so I am holding out some hope that a 30 FPS cap is in the cards. But when you look back at the history of the series on 3DS and Wii U, well, it may not come to pass because those games often also ran with an unlocked frame rate. Either way, we'll find out soon enough. Okay, so how about that performance mode then? This is promising, right? Well, here's what you get. The frame rate does indeed increase just as promised, but the performance still falls well short of 60 frames per second. Now, I will say that while the game still feels somewhat juddery, the improved performance does help with the overall feel of the game, which is nice. Now, if we bring in a side-by-side view here, you get a better idea of how performance and resolution modes stack up against one another. We're generally looking at a 5 to 10 frames per second boost across the board here when using the 1080p performance mode. It's a noticeable improvement in terms of overall frame rate, but you definitely lose a lot of clarity as a result, hence the choice, I suppose. It'll certainly be interesting to see where we go from here though. After all, as I've said several times now, this is just a beta release and likely an older build. We've seen big improvements in MT framework performance on the PS4 in the past. Resident Evil Revelations 2 comes to mind, which launched in a rather sorry state, so perhaps the final release of Monster Hunter World will see noticeable improvements. That said, I still wouldn't necessarily expect a full 60 frames per second here, which brings us back to that 30 FPS cap. Offering the option to cap the frame rate would really improve the overall situation, I feel. For good measure then, here's how the graphics mode stacks up. In terms of frame rate, it sort of falls in between the resolution and performance modes. The extra detail is certainly nice here, of course, but the loss in resolution and performance have a pretty significant impact here, and this has become my least favorite mode included in the beta. So how about the base PS4 then? We're basically looking at visuals that are on par with the Pro version's performance mode, but as you can see, the average frame rate is much lower indeed. In fact, the frame rate can tumble below 30 frames per second, which is something I didn't encounter when testing the PS4 Pro version. Performance here is lower than we'd like, and it winds up feeling jerky as a result. Considering that the majority of players will likely wind up playing on a standard PS4 then, we're really kinda hoping that the final game manages to overcome this problem. And on a somewhat related note, another thing worth pointing out here revolves around animation. Similar to games like Halo 5 and other recent titles, distant animations can play back at a lower rate in order to save on performance. It's not too noticeable when tackling enemies, but as you explore the world it can definitely pop up. Just something to look out for. Overall though, the Monster Hunter World Beta is interesting and sets the stage for the final game. Those final months of development have yielded major improvements in games in the past, so the big question for us right now is, how will the final version differ from what we've played thus far? If the team can implement a 30 FPS cap, or in fact get closer to hitting 60 FPS, everything should work out just fine. Of course, even if these issues persist, Monster Hunter fans really shouldn't have an issue here, as it's kind of become a series staple over the years. It's just that when targeting a new audience, as they seem to be doing with World, it would be great to see those issues corrected. We'll see what happens when the final game hits very soon. That's all for now though. If you enjoyed this quick look at the Monster Hunter World Beta, give us a like, subscribe, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.